There are three components to Marxism with reference to the primary Marxist texts. The components are as follows. Marxism, to begin with, is the materialist interpretation of history. It is the understanding of history developed in the materialist framework. Another component unit of Marxism, which is the one most the critique of the capitalist political economy or the capitalist labor processes, production regimes, and so on. And there is a third component to Marxism, which are dialectics, the supposed science of dialectics. Now, what do we mean by the supposed science of dialectics? Well, this has been explained by Stalin. Broadly, what he argues in this pamphlet is that the science of dialectics is about identifying contradictions in phenomena, in political phenomena, social phenomena, and basing political strategies based on these contradictions. Let me begin by thanking Yuva for extending me this invitation, for having me here today and this afternoon, and I'm very glad to be facing this bright young audience. I'm meant to speak on cultural Marxism. Now let me begin by confessing that I'm not an authority on the matter. I've developed certain positions, certain views regarding this phenomenon, intellectual phenomenon called cultural Marxism, as well as a civil society phenomenon, which is termed cultural Marxism. So I shall be presenting before you my views or the certain positions that I've developed over the years with reference to certain primary texts, and which I believe are parts of the originary or developmental process of cultural Marxism. Now, before I delve into cultural Marxism, before I hold forth on cultural Marxism, we need to understand Marxism a bit, that is, a traditional classical Marxism a bit. What do we mean when we say Marxism? What do we mean when we term a certain individual Marxist? So, as I understand it, there are three components to Marxism with reference to the primary Marxist texts. The components are as follows. Marxism, to begin with, is the materialist interpretation of history. It is the understanding of history developed in the materialist framework. It is the idea that the evolution, the progression of the means and relations of production is fundamental to historical development, is fundamental to historical progression. It is, in other words, the idea that the main causative force in history are means and relations of production, and the class struggle which goes with the evolution and the development of the means and relations of production. Probably this is a little vague for you now, but let me just say for the time being that one component of Marxism is the materialist interpretation of history. All right, so this is one component of Marxism, that it is the materialist interpretation of history. It is the idea that the chief causative force in history are means and relations of production, and the class struggle concomitant with the development, the evolution of the means and relations of production. There is another component unit of Marxism, which is the one most, let us say, most prominent. It is the critique of the capitalist political economy or the capitalist labor processes, production regimes, and so on. And there is a third component to Marxism, which are dialectics, the supposed science of dialectics. Now, what do we mean by the supposed science of dialectics? Well, this has been explained by Stalin in a pamphlet that he wrote in the 1930s. I've forgotten the title of the pamphlet, but broadly what he argues in this pamphlet is that the science of dialectics is about identifying contradictions in phenomena, in political phenomena, social phenomena, and basing political strategies based on these contradictions or the likely course of these contradictions. So here we go. This is what Marxism is about, in my opinion. It is the materialist interpretation of history. It is the supposed science of dialectics. It is the critique, supposedly scientifically done, critique of the capitalist political economy. Now, moving on to the first component, which is the materialist interpretation of history, certain cultural criticisms or cultural points of view were developed by Marx and Engels around it. For example, moving forth from this materialist position, Marx critiqued a social phenomenon, which is the bourgeois nuclear family, and in his Communist Manifesto, which he co-authored with Engels, he made the dismantling of the bourgeois nuclear family one of his revolutionary agendas, a component of his. So I said that there are basically three component units to Marxism in my understanding. First is the materialist interpretation of history. Second is the critique of the capitalist political economy, supposedly scientifically done. And third is the supposed science of dialectics. We did not go deep into these component units as yet because the talk is not about them. It is about this phenomenon called cultural Marxism. Now, moving on, I said a while ago, a few minutes ago, that based on this materialist outlook, based on this materialist interpretation of history, Marx and Engels developed certain cultural positions and certain criticisms or critiques of cultural and social phenomena. Now, one such criticism you encounter in the foundational Marxist text, which is the Communist Manifesto, and which we all know was co-authored by Marx and Engels. So in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels viciously, vehemently attack the bourgeois nuclear family, and they make the dismantling of the bourgeois nuclear family a revolutionary agenda item. I think one criticism leveled against the bourgeois nuclear family by Marx and Engels was that the bourgeois patriarch in this nuclear family setup regards his wife a means of production, probably a means to produce children. If I remember correctly, you may go and verify. Nevertheless, broadly, it suffices to know that Marx and Engels attack the bourgeois nuclear family, a social phenomenon in the Communist Manifesto, and as I said, they make the dismantling of this social phenomenon, the eradication, the abolition of this social phenomenon, a revolutionary agenda item. Then again, monogamous marriage was interpreted materially and critiqued from a materialist point of view by Engels in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and State. The basic fundamental argument that he furthered in this text was that monogamous marriage emerged historically. The basic idea or argument that he advanced in this text was that monogamous marriage emerged historically because men wanted to establish paternity, and they wanted to establish paternity because they wanted to transfer their material belongings, they wanted to bestow their material property upon their children. So this is the reason why monogamous marriage emerged historically, according to Engels. Then moving on to Lenin, a follower of Marx and Engels, and the deviser of the political strategies, which we broadly identify today as Leninist. For example, the Marxist political program and the political strategy does not quite come from Marx, by the way, or the Marxist theory of how to run a revolutionary communist state also does not come from Marx himself. It actually comes from Lenin. Nevertheless, let us not get into these matters. Now, moving on to Lenin, he too developed certain cultural positions which is supposedly furthered, or which could supposedly further a revolutionary agenda. For example, in one of his pamphlets, he visualizes a revolutionary pan-Russian newspaper, which would once again advance the cause of the revolution. So this is a cultural initiative of sorts, bringing out a publication, bringing out a periodical of any kind, irrespective of whether it is social in its accent, or political in its accent, or cultural in its accent, is broadly, in my opinion, a cultural initiative. So Lenin visualized a cultural initiative in the form of a pan-Russian newspaper to advance the cause of the revolution. Then again, he visualized an acculturation process, as we term it in sociology and anthropology, to advance the cause of the revolution. In another of his pamphlets, which is entitled, if I remember correctly, Can Bolsheviks Hold On to Power, or Can Bolsheviks Hold On to Political Power? He argues that Bolsheviks ought to incorporate peasants and workers in large numbers in the revolutionary administration and train them as administrators so that the revolutionary state is cemented, so that the revolutionary Bolshevik state is perpetuated. Now, this process of incorporating, peasants and workers into administration, training them in administrative work, so to speak, is an acculturation process from the sociological and anthropological points of view, as I said. So, when you look at the originary process of Marxism and the originary process of the Marxist political strategies, you see that certain cultural positions, cultural agendas, cultural critiques are woven into this originary process. And these positions, agendas, critiques come from Marx, Engels, and Lenin. So, at its most basic, in my understanding, what is cultural Marxism? It is Marxists, Leninists venturing into cultural politics. It is Marxists, Leninists developing cultural positions from a materialist point of view to advance the supposed cause of the revolution. It is also about Marxists and Leninists in developing cultural agendas of their own. For example, Lenin and Marx too before him developed their own cultural agendas when they argued that the bourgeois nuclear family ought to be dismantled, or it is better dismantled. When Lenin visualized an acculturation process for workers and peasants so that the revolutionary Bolshevik state is cemented, so that it is perpetuated, and so on. But when does the cultural Marxism proper begin? I think the proper beginning of a cultural Marxism, or the proper roots, origin of a cultural Marxism, may be ascribed to a certain Marxist thinker and theorist who was Italian by nationality, and his name was Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci made a theoretical breakthrough of sorts in the 1930s when he argued that a culture is actually not just a manifestation of material relations, that it is not just an outcrop, an emergence from material relations, production relations, but that it is a fundamental, or it might be fundamental to the continuation, maintenance of production relations and the bourgeois capitalist state. In his prison notebooks, which he jotted down while in prison, obviously, he had been imprisoned by the Italian fascist government for 6 or 7 years, I think from 1929 to 1935. So in the prison notebooks, he develops a certain position, which is that the bourgeois capitalist regime imparts a certain level of culture and morality to the citizenry for the maintenance, for the continuation of the bourgeois capitalist relations of production. So the idea that emerges here is that a level of culture, a level of morality, ethics are actually instrumental to the maintenance, to the continuation of the bourgeois capitalist relations of production, and the hegemony of the bourgeoisie rather, in plural, in body politic amongst the citizenry. So this is an inflection point, in my opinion, which is very crucial, and it is at this inflection point that the cultural Marxism properly begins. And crucial to it, or rather foundational, fundamental to it, is the idea that the culture serves a material instrumentality. That culture serves an instrumentality regarding the relations of production, regarding the bourgeois capitalist state, and helps in their continuation, helps in their maintenance, in their perpetuation. Then again, a similar position was developed by Althusser, Louis Althusser later, a French Marxist philosopher. Exactly when, I do not remember, probably a little later, I think in the 1950s, in this very famous pamphlet of his. Let me recall the title of this pamphlet. It is called The Coercive and the Ideological State Apparatus, or something like that. So the basic idea that he developed and advanced in this pamphlet was that the state has at its disposal these means of coercion in the form of the police force, in the form of the army and the prison houses, and so on. And at the same time, the state has at its disposal these means of ideological indoctrination in the form of newspapers and the church. He was writing in a Christian Catholic country, after all, being a French. Whether he was a practicing Catholic or not, definitely not, is immaterial to us, since he was a Marxist. He wasn't a practicing Catholic. Nevertheless, he identified the Catholic Church as an instrument of ideological indoctrination at the disposal of the state, schools, universities, and so on. And implicit in the pamphlet was the idea that these instruments of ideological indoctrination, or these instruments of acculturation, are actually vital to the maintenance of the bourgeois capitalist state and the maintenance of the bourgeois relations of production, that they indoctrinate the public, the citizenry, in a manner that they become instrumental to the maintenance and continuation of the bourgeois capitalist relations of production as workers, of course, or as administrators. Again, an inflection point in the development of cultural Marxism, and this position is broadly derived from this remark, or this position developed by by Gramsci in his prison notebooks. Moving on, in another part of Europe, more scholars, Marxist scholars, looked at culture from a materialist point of view and contributed to this corpus of ideas, contributed to this intellectual phenomenon, which we today identify as cultural Marxism. For example, in the 1930s probably, or at some point in the 1930s, this institute was established in Frankfurt, Germany. Today we know it as the Frankfurt School. It is still in existence, and the name of the institute is the Institute for Social Research, if I remember correctly. And at that point of time, in the 1930s, the director of the institute was a gentleman called Max Horkheimer, Professor Horkheimer. Horkheimer looked at the knowledge production from a materialist point of view, being a Marxist. And he wrote this pamphlet, which continues to be very influential today in the Marxist circles. The name of the pamphlet was Traditional and Critical Theory. By theory, in this case, Professor Horkheimer meant knowledge production in general, all kinds of knowledge production. And again, he further advanced the idea that knowledge production contributes to material processes, to production processes. So here, sort of identified the knowledge production broadly as a handmaid of the capitalist production regime, as something complementary, something that contributes at a very foundational level to the capitalist production process. And contrary to this traditional theory, which is a handmaiden, or which was a handmaiden to the capitalist production process, according to him, he visualized a different kind of theory, a different kind of knowledge production, which would be oppositional to societal mores, societal values, and which would contribute to a progressive development of society. So he visualized an activist role for knowledge production, and this is something which is taken very seriously by the Marxists even today. They ascribe an activist role to every form of knowledge production, and they convert academics into a kind of activism, which is the reason why, because they take this position very seriously even today, and Horkheimer continues to be very influential in the Marxist circles, in case you do not know. Now, Horkheimer had a colleague, his name was Adorno, Theodor Adorno, at the Institute for Social Science Research. Theodor Adorno looked at cultural production from a materialist, Marxist point of view. All right, so now Horkheimer had this colleague whose name was Theodor Adorno, and Adorno looked at the cultural production from a Marxist, materialist point of view, or rather one aspect of cultural production, namely music. And broadly, the position that he came up with was that music had become an instrument to further capitalist hegemony by advancing the cause of a large-scale consumption of goods. Today, we would say, from our vantage position, that according to Adorno, music had become an instrument to promote consumption, or music, or rather musical performances, had become an instrument to promote consumption, and thus they were becoming repetitious. Musical performances, according to him, were becoming jaded, and they were becoming safe in the sense that they would be of the kind that the listening public is familiar with, and the listening public in turn would demand the same kind of performances that they were familiar with. This was the 1930s, for example, when probably gramophones and the mechanical reproduction of music were still not that common amongst the middle class, definitely, and amongst the working classes of Europe. The upper classes definitely could afford the mechanical reproduction of music instruments that mechanically stored and reproduced music, but not the middle class as much, or probably not the working class, definitely not. Anyway, so the means to consume music in those days broadly was still to go to an opera house and listen to a musical performance. And according to Adorno, musical performances were becoming jaded, repetitious, and the public too in its turn was becoming such that it would demand the same kind of musical performances which it was familiar with. And Adorno called this phenomenon regressive listening, that the listening public wanted to regress to the kind of musical performances which were familiar and to which it did not challenge it as much intellectually, emotionally. And this was because of the commercialization of musical performances, of musical production, according to him. And the commercialization was of a kind that musical performances, musical production were becoming occasions to promote the sale of sheet music, printed musical notation, gramophones, musical records, etc. So broadly, the position that he developed was that music, an aspect of cultural production, had been incorporated, had become an aspect of the capitalist consumption-based economy. Again, a materialist Marxist look at culture, and again, a materialist Marxist criticism of culture. And just as Horkheimer before him had done a Marxist materialistic criticism of knowledge production, Adorno, a few years after him, did this materialist Marxist criticism of cultural production, focusing on music. A few decades later, in the 1930s, this individual joined, this academic joined the Institute for Social Science Research. His name is Habermas. He's still around, I think, he's still alive. Jürgen Habermas, a very influential political scientist, I think the most influential political scientist of the 20th century. And he wrote this very, again, important study, an influential study in the 1960s, which was titled The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. It was, as I understand, a materialist Marxist look at the public sphere, that is, in this intermediary zone between the state and the citizenry, in which individuals congregate spontaneously, voluntarily, and exchange views and ideas. I suppose you know that is the general definition of the public sphere. Now, looking at the public sphere from a Marxist point of view, materialist point of view, how did he explain its emergence? Now, broadly, the position again that Habermas developed in the study was that the emergence of the public sphere was concomitant or rather parallel to the emergence and development of finance capitalism. And it happened in the Netherlands primarily, according to him, where finance capitalism originated sort of in its modern frameworks. So Habermas argued that as finance capitalism emerged in the Netherlands, the journal came into existence because people participating in its frameworks needed access to a lot of information and needed to exchange information regarding where to invest, which shares were going up, which shares were coming down, etc., etc. So the journal came into existence where all this information was published and where all this information could be accessed by the subscriber. But the journal gradually came under the purview of the state. It came to be supervised by the state, the publishers were taxed by the state and so on, and censored by the state as well, probably. Thus, what happened was that in bourgeois society, the public sphere came into existence at salons, in the drawing rooms of important wealthy bourgeoisie, where people would come together, they would exchange views and discuss not just matters related to the capitalist economy, but all kinds of issues, all kinds of matters, public affairs, or they would engage in cultural exchanges, discussing music, literature, poetry, and so on. But coming to the 19th and the 20th centuries, in the 20th century especially, Habermas argued that the public sphere had degenerated into a zone into a space dominated by consumption and publicity, consumption and propaganda, where the capitalist economy promoted the consumption of goods and politicians or political interest groups undertook propaganda of various kinds. Anyway, returning to what I said a few minutes ago, let me emphasize that Habermas was a materialist Marxist look at the emergence evolution of the public sphere, and this was a vital intervention. This look was a vital intervention in the originary process, originary development of this intellectual phenomenon called cultural Marxism. This phenomenon, what do I say, became more pronounced again with the establishment of the Birmingham School. I think it was called, formally called Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, and it was established around the middle of the 1960s, where more such cultural criticisms, social criticisms were undertaken from a materialist point of view. Scholars at the Birmingham School, for example, argued that a new consumer and media culture was forming a new mode of a capitalist hegemony. They also looked at how subcultural groups resist dominant forms of culture and identity, creating their own styles and identities. I'm, by the way, quoting from a book by me, one of my collections of essays, and this is a chapter, this is an essay in it, titled The Origins of Cultural Marxism, a Concise Account. Anyway, so in the 1960s, by the middle of the 1960s, as an intellectual phenomenon, as a phenomenon in the academic spaces, cultural Marxism had become quite pronounced and prominent. It was taking the form of these varieties of materialist Marxist criticisms of knowledge production, cultural production of the public sphere, and it was also pitting social groups against each other as they did, or as they tried to do at the Birmingham School, looking at how, as I've just said, subcultural groups or minority groups resist dominant cultural groups and dominant cultures, and so on. Now came another inflection point in the originary or evolutionary process of cultural Marxism, which was in the form of a confession by the then premier of the Soviet Union. His name was Khrushchev. Now, at the 20th Party Congress, which was in 1953, by the way, this was prior to the establishment of the Birmingham School, Khrushchev confessed to the crimes committed by Stalin, as to how many millions of people he had dispatched into concentration camps in Siberia, how many thousands of people who were murdered at his behest, or rather the extrajudicial killings that were carried out at his behest. And this confession sent shockwaves across the communist world, across Eastern Europe, and amongst dedicated communists, amongst dedicated party-affiliated communists, and a lot of them got disillusioned with the Soviet Union. Earlier they had considered the Soviet Union a beacon of hope for the oppressed people of the world and for the working class in general, but with this disillusionment came a certain detachment from party-affiliated communism, party-oriented communism, and Marxism. So a lot of these disillusioned communists who were bitter and disappointed in the Soviet Union gave up their party affiliations and they became lone wolves. And by the time we come to the 1960s, these lone wolves or lone wolf communists were in the academic system in considerable numbers, and they were taking up cultural advocacies of various kinds. They were critiquing, for example, traditional gender roles. They were taking up the cause of the sexual minorities, whom we term LGBTQ today, and they were promoting vehemently minority identities of all kinds, religious, cultural, sexual, and so on. So in this way, the advocacy culture caught on, what we term wokeism or wokery caught on in the academic spaces. This is again a major inflection point in the development, evolution of cultural Marxism. If you see, cultural Marxism today goes hand in hand, or Marxism or left advocacy in general goes hand in hand with wokery, what we term wokery or wokeism, various kinds of activism, advocacy, which are aimed at dismantling social mores, values, culture as we understand them. And this phenomenon dates back to the 1960s. Now, coming to the late 70s and the early 80s, sort of the evolution of cultural Marxism was rounded off, and or the originary process of cultural Marxism was rounded off, and it took the form in which we comprehend it, or rather apprehend it today. And this happened through a quarrel, through an altercation between two Marxists. One was a Marxist humanist, his name was E.P. Thompson, a historian, and the other was this gentleman whose name I took a while ago while delivering this talk. He was Louis Althusser. Althusser was a structural Marxist, a staunch structural Marxist, in the sense that in his understanding of history, in his rigidly materialist understanding of history, human individuals, human beings did not matter at all, or the agency of the individual human being did not matter at all. All that mattered were relations of production and class struggle. And this position we term structural Marxism, in the sense that broad economic structures alone matter, class relations alone matter in this interpretation of history. Individuals, human beings do not matter at all. Now, E.P. Thompson, being a Marxist humanist, considered human agency, individual human beings, important too in historical processes, in causative historical forces. And he picked a quarrel with Althusser, and he wrote this pamphlet, which is termed, what is it called? Orrery of Errors or something. I have this pamphlet, I've read it, but I'm very bad at remembering names of books and pamphlets, by the way, or of authors too, in certain cases. Anyway, it suffices to know that the two quarreled, and Thompson vehemently wrote against him, and he developed the position that human individuals matter, And culture as constituted by, formed by human relationalities matters too. And culture has a material location, material habitus in human relationalities, especially in the form of the family setup. So he took a materialist Marxist look at culture. He argued that, as I said, it has a material location, material habitus, especially in the form of human relationalities, more precisely in the family setup. And thus, in my view, the evolutionary originary process of cultural Marxism was rounded off. Cultural Marxists today, or broadly the left advocates today, the wokes today, take a materialist Marxist look at the family setup. They try to dismantle it. They're critical of traditional cultural values, mores, ethics, etc. And as I've said, this discarding or attempted discarding or this critical look at cultural values, mores, etc. is dateable to the 1960s when lone wolf, unaffiliated communists took over academic spaces. This is, in my view, how cultural Marxism emerged, or rather cultural Marxism has emerged and evolved. It's a time for me to conclude because my wristwatch is showing 3 p.m. I conclude here then, and I hope that I made sense to you. Thank you very much for your patience and kind listening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Professor Dey gave you a very extensive introduction to cultural Marxism and its origin story. So I again won't take you back to it. And in any case, I don't think I could have done any better. So that is the perfect crystallization of how cultural Marxism came into being. So I'll try to be a little more interactive so that I understand that how do you see cultural Marxism as to what it is and how it affects our current understanding of politics, current understanding of other issues like caste, issues like perhaps language and nationality, nationalism. How cultural Marxism affects these issues. So before I do that, I want to understand कि आप culture, जब culture word use करते हैं हम, तो culture का मतलब आप क्या समझते हैं? So basically civilizational development जो gradual होता है, that's an important thing that it has to be gradual. It cannot be a rapid development. Civilizational मतलब सालों से. Civilization एक दिन में तो नहीं बनती है. Civilization सालों लगते हैं बनने में. तो culture is something that develops over a period of time, and it is something that is not immediate. It will, for a civilization to have a culture, it takes a lot of time. Correct? Now, in India, भारत में अगर आपसे कोई पूछेगा कि सिविलाइजेशनल कल्चर क्या है तो आपका जवाब क्या होगा? So as I understand it, and this is true in fact with all countries, that every country has a culture of its own, because every country has some form of civilization in the past that is gradually developing to its present state. In England, perhaps that is the Church of England. Church of England, क्योंकि UK में जो state religion है, that comes from state Church of England. In India, perhaps the undertone is Hindu. अगर आप there are, of course, it's a melting pot of different cultures, but if you talk about the cultural undertones, जो सरफेस के नीचे एक कल्चर है इंडिया का, वो हमेशा से हिंदू रहा है, क्योंकि आफ्टर ऑल व्हेन यू टॉक अबाउट सिविलाइजेशन फॉर द फर्स्ट 1000 years, which was before the first Islamic invasion began, the culture essentially was Hindu, and in fact after the invasion also the culture has remained Hindu, and it sort of influenced Islam in itself, and Islam changed and there were new tenets of culture in Islam like Sufism, which was moderate in nature. So the undertone has always been Hindu, and cultural Marxism in its present form talks about, or at least the postulates that whatever this cultural undertone was is a hegemonic cultural undertone, and that has to be destroyed, and only if it is destroyed then it can be replaced by something else which will assist in bringing the other revolution that is always talked about in Marxism. जो राजनीतिक विज्ञान के यहाँ पे विद्यार्थी हैं उनको ये समझ में आएगा कि मार्क्सिज्म एसेंशियली क्या कहता है, एंड देयरफॉर cultural Marxism is a derivative of Marxism. Marxism requires at the end of the day that whatever culture, whatever economic system that is prevalent in the country, जो भी सिस्टम है कंट्री के अंदर इस वक्त एक्सचेंज का, इकनॉमी का, वो चेंज होना चाहिए और उसकी जगह क्या आना चाहिए, प्रोलिटरेट रेवोल्यूशन आना चाहिए, वर्कर्स और पीजेंट्स की पार्टी बननी चाहिए। वो ऐसा स्टेट लाएंगे जो सबके लिए काम करेगा, किसी को अपनी क्षमता से ज़्यादा काम करने की ज़रूरत नहीं है, उनको अपनी ज़रूरतों के आधार पे जितना उनको चाहिए उतना वो मिलेगा। बेसिकली सस्टेनेंस विल बी प्रोवाइडेड ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ how much they require, and they will work only to the extent of their capacity, nothing more. This is what Marxism envisages. And cultural Marxism says that in order to bring this revolution, we need to do a separate process, which is that जो भी culture है country का वो हमारे को change करना पड़ेगा, because it will create conditions which is conducive to bringing that revolution. This is what cultural Marxism in its very basic understanding of it is. Communism is the ultimate form of Marxism, as I understand it. So I have studied political science, but I'm not a student. I haven't really been a student of political science. And the reason for is that I always thought it was very utopian, and therefore my understanding is very elementary, very basic. But I believe that it is important to have this elementary understanding of Marxism. Why? Because tomorrow you will think for yourself as to why a particular theory that comes out of Marxism इज राइट और रॉन्ग। ये आप अपने लिए सोचिए कि क्या सही है क्या गलत है, उसके लिए आपको एक बेसिक अंडरस्टैंडिंग होनी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है। तो मार्क्सिज्म अल्टीमेटली क्या कहता है कि देयर हैज़ टू बी अ सेपरेट फॉर्म ऑफ इकोनॉमिक ऑर्डर इन द स्टेट। इन ऑर्डर टू ब्रिंग दैट इकोनॉमिक ऑर्डर, द हेजेमनिक कल्चर ऑफ द स्टेट हैज़ टू बी डिस्ट्रॉयड। दैट इज एंड ओनली देन द कंडीशंस कंड्यूसिव टू मार्क्सिज्म वुड, एंड फॉर दैट मैटर कम्युनिज्म, विल रूट इटसेल्फ इन द कंट्री। तो कैसे होगा ये? होगा ऐसे कि जो भी प्रेवलेंट कल्चर है उस कंट्री का उसको आपको चेंज करना पड़ेगा। एंड हाउ टू डू दैट इज दैट यू इन्फिल्ट्रेट ऑल फॉर्म्स ऑफ नॉलेज ट्रांसफर, जैसे अभी प्रोफेसर दे बता रहे थे दैट यू हैव टू इन्फिल्ट्रेट इट एंड देन चेंज इट। सो टुडे व्हाट मार्क्सिस्ट अंडर सी दे ट्राई the military solution to bring Marxism was tried in Soviet Russia, it collapsed. In fact, communism is the only means of production that collapsed in the very century it was brought in. Capitalism has been surviving for 300 years. Feudalism survived for centuries. जो मार्क्सिज्म से जो कैपिटलिज्म से पहले था, मार्क्सिज्म इज द ओनली मीन्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन that started with the Soviet Revolution in 1917 and collapsed in 1991, is the only means of production that fell within the century it was created. So what Marxists understood from this was that if we use force to bring in Marxist revolution, it will never survive, it will collapse. There are other reasons for its collapse also, which are economic in nature, which I'll talk about briefly later on. But therefore they understood that in order for it to sustain, अगर आपको मार्क्सिज्म चलाना है किसी कंट्री में, तो उसके लिए आपको पहले उनका कल्चर बदलना पड़ेगा। ये कल्चरल मार्क्सिज्म की ब्रॉड अंडरस्टैंडिंग है। वो कैसे होगा? दे विल इन्फिल्ट्रेट द मीडिया, दे विल इन्फिल्ट्रेट द sources of knowledge in the society, which is universities, campuses, और भी जो भी आप मतलब सोच सकते हैं, politics for that matter. So I now get back to what is the cultural undertone of this country, and I briefly enunciated that it is Hindu in nature, and I'm not saying that it is virulent and therefore Hinduism, I'm not talking about a militant form of Hinduism, I'm talking about a very subtle undertone of Hinduism. For example, जैसे आप किसी भी फंक्शन से पहले दिया जलाते हैं, यू नेवर आस्क कि आप गेस्ट का रिलीजन क्या है, बिकॉज यू नो एंड अंडरस्टैंड दैट द कल्चरल अंडरटोन इज हिंदू, एंड दिस इज नॉट अ डिस्प्ले ऑफ हिंदुइज्म, बट इट इज द डिस्प्ले ऑफ आवर कल्चर. द कल्चरल अंडरटोन इज exemplified by lighting a diya, because we believe it's a symbol of knowledge, we believe it's a symbol of information. So in a very subtle sense of the term, the cultural undertone in this country has always been Hindu, and other countries have it differently. Cultural undertone of this country, इंग्लैंड में चर्च ऑफ इंग्लैंड है, रशिया में रशियन ऑर्थोडॉक्स चर्च है, मैं उसकी बात कर रहा हूँ. जो कंट्री भले ही सेकुलर हो, उसकी एक अंडरटोन की बात कर रहा हूँ मैं. सो now coming to why, so therefore cultural Marxism has always thought of destroying or at least replacing this culture through various means. Now why it is wrong, or why it is damaging, why is it destructive? I tell you why. Any imposition on the society which is not natural in nature, in my opinion, cannot sustain itself, because it is human nature is very individualistic. It's very free, and if you try to subjugate it, or if you try to capture it, if you try to sort of confine it artificially, it will never work. It will never work. If you want to bring change in the society, in my opinion, it always has to be through reforms and not revolution. Any revolution in history, human history, which has been brought artificially has collapsed or has negative effects on the society, and this is something that you would gradually learn as you grow old. This is the old conservative wisdom that any revolution that you bring in society which is not reform, which is not reformative, which is not gradual, will collapse. Russian Revolution collapsed in the very century it happened. French Revolution led to the reign of terror in France. 1789, if I'm not wrong, was the date of was the year of French Revolution. It led to the reign of terror, where everybody was correcting everybody else. Whoever was thought to not confining with the basic principles of French Revolution was hanged. और आप हिस्ट्री में कोई भी रेवोल्यूशन उठा के देख लीजिए, there is a very famous quote that revolution devours its children and imprisons its fathers. जो भी revolution लेके आता है, the beneficiaries of revolutions are never those who bring in the revolution. And in India, you see it on a very small level. I tell you, in 2011, you saw the Anna Hazare movement. That was a revolutionary movement, and who were its beneficiaries? A different set of leaders altogether than the ones who began that revolution. आज आप अन्ना हजारे को न्यूज़ में नहीं देखते हैं, आज आप देखते हैं केजरीवाल को, किरण बेदी उतनी पॉपुलर नहीं है, because it was a revolutionary movement. Its objectives were revolutionary. They wanted to bring a bill that was revolutionary in nature to counter corruption. What happened was, neither the bill came nor those people who initially started the revolution are in power. There is an entirely different set of individuals who now are in power, and their objectives have become radically different. And that's just a small example as to what happens when revolutionary change is adopted. And that's why I say that cultural Marxism, because it's revolutionary in its orientation, is one of the reasons why it would lead to a society which is not better off than where it began. B, the beneficiaries of cultural Marxism, if the revolution is taken up to the hilt, will be an entirely different set of persons than who initially thought that cultural Marxism in form of should be introduced in education, should be introduced in media. And for that reason, I think it is something that we need to at least think about critically, see whether it's beneficial or not. I'll now briefly talk about how in Indian society cultural Marxism is trying to take its root, and how this has already been tried in American society, and how American society today is facing the brunt of cultural Marxism invading its universities, media, law, and everything else. So cultural Marxism says the ultimate aim of cultural Marxism is to create a society, or at least envision a society, if not create, because I don't think they'll ever be able to create such a society, is where everybody is equal. There are no oppressive agents in the society. Now, what is the end effect of it? It says that there has to be a party of those individuals which will lead the nation into a worker peasant revolution. And what the party says is correct, because it's working in the favor of the peasants and workers. The moment you disagree with the party, you are disagreeing not with the party, you are disagreeing with the knowledge of the workers and individuals. You are disagreeing with the revolution that the party is bringing. And what is the effect then? The effect is you are the enemy of the state, right? If you criticize that party's knowledge, the end effect is you are criticizing the knowledge of the workers and peasants. You are in fact acting you are trying to diffuse the revolution that is bringing the change in the society, and therefore you have to be eliminated, not the thought of the worker and the party. And I'll tell you one other thing. Essentially every communist regime at the end of the day will lead to totalitarianism, and you have seen this example in India. In fact, you don't have to go anywhere else. Indira Gandhi's regime is the only regime that actually imposed emergency in India. Everybody says that the reasons for it was political in nature. Jayaprakash Narayan movement was going on, she had lost the election, but there is also an economic underlying reason for it. In Indira Gandhi's regime, the economy was strangled hold. Essential Commodities Act was made stringent. License quota Raj was introduced to up to the hilt. It started off perhaps in Nehru, but Nehru never created the economy that was so strangulated that Indira Gandhi did, because Garibi Hatao was one of her slogans, and her idea of Garibi Hatao was socialism. Now, market is the only way that you can decide how a product is actually, what is the cost of a product, actual cost of the product, because आपके पास एक चीज़ है बेचने के लिए, मेरे पास पैसे हैं खरीदने के लिए, मैं जितने पैसे देने को तैयार हूँ उतने ही उस प्रोडक्ट की वैल्यू है. कोई मुझसे ज़्यादा देने को तैयार है तो जितनी कम होगा प्रोडक्ट उतनी ज़्यादा उसकी वैल्यू बढ़ेगी. दैट मार्केट डिसाइड्स. बट द मोमेंट स्टेट कम्स इन एंड सेज कि मैं डिसाइड करूँगा कि इस प्रोडक्ट की वैल्यू कितनी है, then state has to be given that power, because now it is not being decided by how limited that product is. State decide करेगा उसके प्राइस क्या है, और स्टेट अगर प्राइस डिसाइड करेगा तो उसको पावर चाहिए डिसाइड करने की. और अगर वो प्रोडक्ट कम है और स्टेट उसकी वैल्यू तब भी कम डिसाइड करता है, then it has to stave off any person who is trying to get it by unscrupulous means. And at the end of the day, you will need an apparatus, a police state that ensures that कोई भी व्यक्ति उस चीज़ की वैल्यू से ज़्यादा उसको ले नहीं रहा. Ultimately, this will always lead to a state which is totalitarian in nature, because state is interfering in minutest of things in the economy. State अगर कहता है कि पेपर न्यूज़पेपर की वैल्यू X है और कोई बंदा उसको Y में बेचना चाह रहा है तो स्टेट उसको पकड़ लेगा. Understanding? अगर, and this happened in India, in fact, it happened in India that slowly, when the state started deciding every minute part of the economy, when it started deciding that fundamental right to property is not important, then ultimately what happened was Indira Gandhi became more and more totalitarian. The state of India started deciding each and every aspect of the economy, and ultimately it ended up with the imposition of emergency. So anyway, so that's one of the reasons why I say that you will begin, see, no, good intentions will always be there in communism. Good intentions will always be there in communism, that it is a government by the people, for the people, created by the people. But at the end of the day, when they started off the revolution, would radically change once the revolution is achieved. Because and the reason is this, that the society that revolution tries to create can never be achieved. You can never completely eliminate human misery, and this is something we always need to understand. We can only elevate it to a certain extent. State is always created to create opportunity for people. It is never created to ensure equality of outcomes. This is perhaps the underlying lesson that one needs to learn, that creation of the state. आप में से जो भी राजनीतिक विज्ञान के स्टूडेंट्स हैं उन्होंने जॉन लॉक ज़रूर पढ़ा होगा. जॉन लॉक और बाकी दो थिंकर्स जिनके साथ सोशल कॉन्ट्रैक्ट थ्योरी बनी है, थॉमस हॉब्स और रूसो. थॉमस हॉब्स क्या कहते थे कि स्टेट ऑफ नेचर इज समथिंग वेयर पीपल आर किलिंग एवरीबडी एल्स, and for ensuring the security they create a state which is the ultimate power, source of power, Leviathan. But जॉन लॉक आके कहते हैं कि नहीं, ऐसा नहीं. स्टेट ऑफ नेचर में भी लोगों के पास एक इनहेरेंट रीजनिंग है जिससे वो एक दूसरे को मानना नहीं चाहते, बट सिक्योरिटी नहीं है. तो सिक्योरिटी क्रिएट करने के लिए दे गिव अप अ पार्ट ऑफ देयर राइट्स सो दैट स्टेट कैन बी क्रिएटेड टू प्रोटेक्ट व्हाट? 3 things: life, liberty and property. Therefore, in Locke's conception of state, state had a very limited role. In Marx's conception of state is radically different, because it says that state does not have to just protect life, liberty and property, and the state has to ensure that everybody has other socio-economic rights. Now, I'll tell you this, that state after a point cannot ensure it. It cannot. It does not have the delivery mechanism. It never will have the delivery mechanism. It can only create circumstances where you can achieve your potential, and some of you might not be able to achieve it, because human, although are created equal, but are granted with different faculties. सब आप और मैं सब हम एक समान हैं, but हमारी क्षमता अलग अलग है, and that is not something to be frowned upon. You have that dignity. That does not mean that people should be treated differently, but it does mean that the state should not strive more than it should to create circumstances where equality of outcome is achieved. All it can do is achieve equality of opportunity. Cultural Marxism is all about equality of outcome. Therefore, it says that the state has to be created in such a way where certain things in this society has to be radically eradicated. So for example, in America, it is about racism. It says that racism has to be radically eradicated. It does not, it has no right to exist. What does the conservative wisdom say? It says that you are right, racism has no place in this country. And in Indian context, caste has no place in this country. And there is nothing wrong with that, they are right about that. The only difference is how we and by we I mean conservatives, and by others I mean cultural Marxists, talk about how to eradicate it. Conservatives say कि अगर इसको ख़त्म करना है तो प्रोसेस ग्रेजुअल होगा, प्रोसेस रिफॉर्मेटिव होगा. Cultural Marxists say it has to be revolutionary. I tell you that revolutions have a problem. Revolution have a very simple problem, that the people who are leading the revolution have a different set of objectives. The beneficiaries of revolution have a different set of objectives. And it is always the case that those who begin the revolution and those who are the beneficiaries of the revolution are two different sets of people. I have given you the Indian context. I'll give you another example, another revolution and revolution in a very minute sense of the term that happened in India. Jayaprakash Narayan ji की movement थी, क्रांति, संपूर्ण क्रांति उनका नारा था. उस टाइम पे बहुत सारे स्टूडेंट लीडर्स भी आए देश के अंदर. कौन थे वो लीडर्स? लालू प्रसाद यादव, ठीक है, नीतीश कुमार, ये सारे लीडर्स आए. I ask you today, how many of you would leave Delhi and go to Bihar to study? आप में से कौन लोग यहाँ पे आज छोड़ के, दिल्ली छोड़ के बिहार जाने को तैयार हैं? कोई भी नहीं. क्यों नहीं जाना चाहते आप? वो क्योंकि that state was for 15 years ruled by Lalu Prasad Yadav and he ruined the economy. He did. There's no doubt about it. And he is one of the child of that revolution that Jayaprakash Narayan led. So this is something that you need to realize. I'm not saying cultural Marxism is entirely wrong. I'm not even saying that what I am today saying is entirely correct. But what I want you to learn from this is this, that आपको 3-4 चीज़ें हमेशा याद रखनी चाहिए जब भी आप राजनीतिक विज्ञान या कोई भी ऐसा सोशल साइंस का सब्जेक्ट पढ़ोगे. पहली चीज़ कि इस रिफॉर्म का ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या है और इस रेवोल्यूशन का ऑब्जेक्टिव क्या है और क्या ये रेवोल्यूशन अचीव कर पाएगा वो ऑब्जेक्टिव. थिंक लाइक somebody who has, and you don't need, like, do not need to read very big thinkers for this. Always have 3 or 4 basic principles in mind. First, and I'll conclude with this, basic principles: state will never be able to guarantee everything that under the sun. Healthcare, education, or बाकी सारी चीज़ें, state has a role to play, but it will never be able to guarantee everything under the sun as a matter of right. It will try to give you as much as it can, but it will try to give you as much as it can, but at the end of the state is limited. The more you try to expand the state to ensure these rights are available, the more it will impinge upon your rights to under the pretext of guaranteeing them. वो कहेगा मुझे आपकी लैंड पे हॉस्पिटल बनाना है, आपकी लैंड में जब्त कर रहा हूँ, ठीक है, क्योंकि मेरे को इस पर हॉस्पिटल बनाना है. State will always be totalitarian in nature, and therefore the state has to be limited up to a certain extent. And I therefore argue that Lockean conception of state is the ideal state, where a state is limited. It tries to guarantee certain right, but not with the objective that the equality of outcome should be there, but only that opportunity is available. It will create schools and colleges, but only after acquiring the property, giving you the entire compensation. The other thing is that you should always suspect revolutions. You should always suspect revolutions, see what their objectives are, whether they will be able to achieve. Don't get carried away by romantic stories. Okay? The problem with cultural Marxism is that it is always romantic in nature, and therefore it tries to carry you away. तुम्हें कल मैं आके कहूँ कि तुम अगर इस रेवोल्यूशन का पार्ट बनते हो तो देश में करप्शन खत्म हो जाएगा. Why would not you get carried away? I will get carried away कि मेरे को अपने देश में करप्शन खत्म करना है तो मैं कल से मूवमेंट का पार्ट बनूंगा. But I ask you this, can a single bill eradicate corruption in this country? No, it cannot. There has to be multiple institutions, and there has to be not a single law, but there has to be a slow change in how you view the governmental process. There has to be, for example, eliminate humans where they are not necessary. जहाँ पे भी आप computerization धीरे धीरे करोगे, human interaction कम करोगे, वहाँ पे अपने आप धीरे धीरे करप्शन कम हो जाएगा. That's why most of the government tries to now deliver services through digitalized means, and now they have a problem because they are saying that this is their violation of right to privacy and all of that. But just see what the objectives are. Always suspect them. हमेशा आप सस्पेक्ट करो और सोचो अपने लिए खुद से कि क्या वो ऑब्जेक्टिव अचीव कर पाएंगे जिस तरीके से जिस बात की वो बात कर रहे हैं. एंड थर्ड थिंग इज, Indian left and cultural Marxists always try to argue this, that they are the dissenting entity in the country. The media is the dissenting media, the academia is the dissenting academia. I tell you this, that it is not the dissent. मैं 6 साल दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में पढ़ा हूँ. I will identify as a conservative, although I don't like these labels. I was the minority in all these institutions. If I would come tomorrow in a political science class and says that I detest Marxism, it has led to death of millions and millions of people in Soviet Union and China, I am the minority in the campus. मेरे जैसे आपको 10 मिलेंगे बस, बाकी सारी जगहों पे आपको नहीं मिलेंगे. They always try to pretend that they are the dissenting opinion, but they are not. My opinion is the dissenting opinion in the campus. You would not find a lot of people who are dissenting. Try to form a dissenting opinion, and not for the sake of being dissenting, but see what is the other side of the story. आपको अगर कोई कह रहा है कि cultural Marxism is a very important aspect of वो, you need to argue with yourself and think, why is cultural Marxism so important? What is the current status that needs to be changed? Is cultural Marxism the only way to do it? Can the reform not come within the community? आपकी community में कोई ना कोई reform ज़रूर हुआ होगा. And those people who were the reformers were from your own community. Christians के अंदर हुआ है. Renaissance जो आया, Renaissance 14-15 century में यूरोप में Renaissance जो आया और जो डिसेंटिंग मूवमेंट्स आई, वो सारी की सारी क्रिश्चियनिटी के अंदर से आई. जो हिंदुज़म में आई वो सारी हिंदुज़म के अंदर से आई. Why is Kerala today so high in Human Development Index? One of the reasons is that Kerala saw the reform movements in the very beginning, and all of those reformers were Hindus themselves. And I'm not saying for my religion alone. You look at Christianity, all the reformers in Christianity were Christians. You don't need reformers from the outside. And the good thing about the reformers from your own community is that they understand what the limitations of reforms are. They never argue. For example, in America, slavery, when it was abolished initially, when the Declaration of Independence was wrote, when the Bill of Rights were introduced, they did not abolish slavery throughout the America. In fact, it was properly not abolished till 1960s. But the initial eradication of slavery in the northern states of America, अमेरिका में अगर आप ज्योग्राफी देखेंगे, there are northern states and southern states. The initial abolition of slavery was by Americans themselves. The blacks started to agitate, African Americans started to agitate against slavery in the 1960s, Martin Luther King and everything. But the initial reform came within the community. And at that time, they did not completely abolish slavery. The reason is that they understood the limitation. They understood the limitation that if they eradicate slavery today, then it will lead to another civil war, and it will be a never-ending process. Reform करो लेकिन slow reform की वजह से ये होता है कि आपको आपके revolution की limitation पता लगती है, ठीक है? आपको आपके reform की limitation पता लगेगी. You would understand that human change more by persuasion than by the barrel of the gun, as Maoists suggest. And I'll conclude with this. 2017 में दंतेवाड़ा में 1000 साल पुरानी गणेश जी की मूर्ति हिल टॉप पे थी, उसको गिरा दिया गया. माओइस्ट ने गिराया. आप सबके पास गूगल है, आप चाहे तो गूगल भी कर सकते हैं. उसको रिस्टोर कर दिया था बाद में. दंतेवाड़ा में था, छत्तीसगढ़ में 2017 में. Now you would think that a 1000-year-old Ganesh Murti, what threat does it hold to a communist with a gun? Nothing. It's a lifeless idol. It's not saying anything. Why did they do that? Because they believe that by destroying this idol, they can destroy the culture of the country, and once they destroy the culture of the country, they will, replace it with their own. I would say now finally two things. They tried this thing in Soviet Russia as well. They destroyed churches there. The moment 1991 Soviet Russia collapsed, most of the churches were restored. that idol was restored. That Ganesh idol that they threw over the altar was restored. And this is where they don't understand, I would say, the ingenuity of human nature, which is that no matter how much you try to subjugate it, eradicate it, colonize it, it'll regain itself, because that is your natural state of being. आप मैग्नेट को कितना भी चाहो साउथ और साउथ को मिलाना नहीं मिलेगा, नॉर्थ और साउथ मिलेगा. This is the inherent human nature that John Locke talked about, that there is a certain degree of sociability. इंसान एक पॉलिटिकल एनिमल है, उसको एक दूसरे से बात करनी है, वो हमेशा एक दूसरे को मानने के नहीं चाहता. तो स्टेट हम इसलिए बना रहे हैं ताकि स्टेट हमारे लिए थोड़े से राइट सिक्योर कर सके. वही बात ये है कि ह्यूमन नेचर इज सच दैट इट विल नेवर लेट मार्क्सिस्ट कल्चरलिज्म टू टेक होल्ड. इट विल ओनली बी रिस्पॉन्सिव टू reforms from within and through persuasion, not through violence, not through revolutions which will eradicate certain understanding of how you live. Revolutions will never do that. And the moment the revolution ends, it will go back to it. चाइना में इतने सालों से तिब्बतन लोगों के ऊपर subjugation चल रहा है. I tell you this and I am very confident that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, I can't give you a date, but at certain time and in certain place, that country will be free again, because you cannot eradicate human nature. आप कितना ही controlling state बना लो आज, and India is a perfect example of it. Was Indira Gandhi able to do it? No, she wasn't able to do it. The moment elections were called, she lost power. So therefore, I end with this, that human nature cannot be changed. Cultural Marxism perhaps may try it, and therefore you need to develop that 3 principles, that state cannot guarantee everything, that revolutions have always have to be suspected, and third, try to question yourself and question whatever is around you in a way that you are the dissenting opinion in the campuses. Okay? And read more books. This is the last thing I leave you with. Always read what the cultural Marxists have to say, because without reading them you cannot critique them, without reading them you cannot question them. And please never tell yourself that there are no good conservative writers, thinkers in India or abroad. There are many, and the good thing is that we don't need a lot of books, because conventional wisdom is something that is inherent in you. You conventionally know certain things can never work, and therefore you do not require, and please don't take it as an anti-intellectualism that is always accused of towards the right, that ये तो anti-intellectual लोग हैं, ये किताबें नहीं पढ़ते, ये तो लाठी डंडा चलाते हैं, इनको कुछ आता जाता नहीं है. ऐसा नहीं है. There are amazing thinkers, and Indian ही नहीं, आप बाहर के पढ़िए. I am currently reading this book called Conservative Sensibility by George F. Will, and it talks about this Lockean conception of the state, where state can only guarantee a limited form of rights, and rest everything is something that you would have to strive for as an individual. Look at your individual identity. With that, I rest my case. Thank you so much.